You got a gig at the George Eastman Museum in Rochester, a round table.
Yeah.
That's a cool joint. I've been there.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I've never been there before.
Yo! Welcome to My Summer Lair. I'm your host, Sammy. I still get excited at the movies when the lights go down. Younan. This My Summer Lair episode, it requires a DeLorean because we're going back to November 26, 1975. Sneak Previews, a film review show created by WTTW, a PBS member station in Chicago, broadcast the first episode. WTTW stood for, I guess stands for still, but stood for Window to the World. That, Window to the World, that would prove to be remarkably accurate. Sneak Previews, the film review TV show, featured two newspaper critics who presented short clips of movies in current release, and then they would go on to debate the movie's merits, energetically defending their remarks if the other critic disagreed, which happened often. Of course, those two critics hosting that TV show, Sneak Previews, were Gene Siskel of the Chicago Tribune and Roger Ebert of the Chicago Sun-Times. Over time, the show would evolve. The name would change. They left PBS, but at its core, it was Siskel and Ebert discussing and debating the week's new releases. 1975. Good gravy. Thumbs up, thumbs down. That wouldn't be introduced until 1982. I learned both these facts because A, I'm a smarty pants, and B, because my guest Matt Singer has written Opposable Thumbs, How Siskel and Ebert Changed Movies Forever. This is a biography of that enduring film criticism TV show. A highly recommended read from Matt Singer, Opposable Thumbs. Matt is the editor and critic at Screen Crush and a member of the New York Film Critics Circle. You're going to hear his deep and abiding passion for Siskel and Ebert. This book was clearly a labor of love. Opposable Thumbs reveals Siskel and Ebert's hilarious and humble beginnings at WTTW, where their film review show was originally called, this is a terrible name for a hashtag, so ready for this? The show was originally called Opening Soon at a Theater Near You, before being renamed Sneak Previews. More fun facts. Opposable Thumbs goes behind the scenes with many of the people responsible for the show in its numerous incarnations. Matt's compelling biography shares a wealth of stories about hilarious high noon showdowns between the hosts and experimental TV gimmicks, such as Stinker of the Week, a terrible movie block where they added a third co-host on the set, a live skunk. Whew, that stinks. Opposable Thumbs is fascinating because it's our era, that is gone now. This is how Siskel and Ebert's TV show became an established cultural institution influencing TV, especially ESPN. Shout out to Pardon the Interruption, film criticism, film marketing, and so much more. Hopefully, really, honestly, truly, and hopefully, you give this My Summer Lair episode 2 thumbs up, which is exactly what Siskel and Ebert did for Speed 2 Cruise Control. Oh man. Speed 2 Cruise Control. Wow. You better believe that comes up in my conversation with Matt as we talk about his notable book, Opposable Thumbs, How Siskel and Ebert Changed Movies Forever. Stephanie, as my co-host, would you please do the honors?
Sound, the final frontier. My Summer Lair is an enterprise, a pop culture voyage with a continuing mission to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new creators and celebrate established producers, to boldly go where no podcast has gone before. And now here is your host, Sammy Younan.
I want to start with a fun place, actually, because having finished your book and doing all the research for Opposable Thumbs, How Siskel and Ebert Changed Movies Forever, where do you now stand on Gene Siskel's fantastic 70s mustache? That's quite the soup strainer.
It's beautiful. I think it's fun. I think it's kitschy. You know, I have a little facial hair myself right now, which is not very good. I've never had very good facial hair. And I've never had the guts to rock a full, thick, bushy mustache like that. So I respect any man who is willing to do that. And I think when you pair the mustache with the big lapels, as they did in the 70s,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a real look. Maybe not the look that I would personally choose, but I enjoy, look, these guys were not exactly, no offense, they were not exactly movie star handsome. They had to do what they could to look like they belonged on television, which, I mean, at the time, it kind of included, facial hair, some big
Mm-hmm.
lapels, some crazy patterned jackets. That was in 1975. So I respect it.
Yeah, I mean the derogatory media phrase is like sometimes it's radio face, right? You have a face for radio.
Sure.
Right? And so these guys obviously were both Siskel and Ebert were great writers and they made sense for newspapers where you didn't necessarily have to see them, but now to put them on TV was an interesting like leap.
Sure, but I mean, on the other hand, that was, I think, part of the reason that they were so successful was, they didn't look like TV stars, but then that also meant they didn't look like pretty much anyone else on television,
Mhm.
and that made them different. And I think it also contributed to their air of authority on TV, right? I mean, you knew that these guys weren't cast on the show because of their hunky good looks, right? Like,
Mhm.
I'm sure we could all, if we sat here and thought about it, think of someone who we've seen on TV who, was presented as an authority in some field. Doesn't have to be movies. It could be any number of things. And we recognized that the main reason they were on TV was because, they were handsome or attractive, or they had a great voice, or the camera really liked their face, or whatever it was. Like Anchorman is almost, like the premise of Anchorman is almost that. It's like, Ron Burgundy is not exactly a hard-hitting journalist.
Mhm.
And he has a Gene Siskel-esque mustache, but he looks great and he sounds good and he wears the suits and like it's all about kind of making fun of that idea of that sort of TV personality.
Mhm.
The fact that Gene and Roger, they weren't quite as polished. I think it sort of subliminally spoke to an audience and said, look, these guys, maybe they're not the most glamorous dudes,
Mhm.
but maybe that says that they're here for another reason, which is that they know their stuff, they know their movies, and they're gonna speak to this subject with some authority.
And this subject that they're talking about with authority about in terms of movies, this for you was like your equivalent of, you write about this in acknowledgments for Opposable Thumbs. This for you was like the kid under the flashlight with the National Geographic, right? Like,
Yeah, basically that for me personally, yes, that's what it was. I write about it in the acknowledgments and it's totally true. When I was like somewhere in the 11 to 13-year-old range, like I became obsessed with the show, and at the same time, because it was a syndicated TV show in those days, we're talking the early 1990s, the show would bounce around the dial a little bit back when televisions had dials,
Mhm.
and you didn't always even know when it was going to be on from week to week. You would turn it on at the time you thought it was on, and the channel would be saying something like, Siskel and Ebert will not be seen at this time, so we may present to you,
Yeah.
you know,
That was another
Bowling with the
tradition too.
Stars.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what was happening was, at least where I grew up in suburban New Jersey, the TV stations that syndicated the show kind of kept pushing it later and later. And so it would be on Sunday nights at 11, 11:30, even midnight, which was way past my bedtime when I was 11 years old, 12
Mhm.
years old. And so I would have to pretend to go to sleep and then like lie awake in my darkened room. And then hope my parents went to bed
Mhm.
before the show came on so that I could then turn the TV back on at a very low volume and watch Siskel and Ebert late into the night. Yes, that is, I was never into National Geographic and I didn't need a flashlight because it was television, but
Yeah.
essentially the idea is the same.
Yeah. And so who is this show for? Because like nerds have been around for decades, obviously, especially after World War II. But as a collective, nerds didn't really take off properly until like the 80s. So who is this show for?
Well, when it started, I think it was intended really just for passionate moviegoers. You have to remember we're talking about this is the mid 1970s, not the early 1990s when the show first started on PBS. And there wasn't anything like it at the time on television. There is no internet. Reliable information about movies coming to theaters is a lot harder to come by unless you're going to, buy a newspaper every Friday or something. And so when the show launched, it was really about it was almost more of a news show, or as much a news show as it was a movie review show. It did have reviews even in the earliest days, but like the very first episode, they're basically giving a news report on what they saw at the Chicago International Film Festival. Once the show became what it was, they would almost never do anything like that, like dispatches, festival reports, news pieces. That was not really what the show was. When people think of Siskel and Ebert, they think of these two guys reviewing a movie and yelling at each other. And when it started, it was much more about like, here's what's coming, in their case, to Chicago this week. Here's what's notable. Here are the new films opening. Here's the bad films that we've seen that are the dogs of the week. And the other thing that the show had was clips. At the time, it was, again, this is pre-internet. You couldn't just take out your phone and say, oh, I hear Furiosa is opening in theaters this weekend. Let me go watch the trailer. That did not exist in any form. Maybe you could see a commercial on TV, but even, back then that was much less common. And so the show kind of existed in some ways, especially before Gene and Roger got really good at doing their end of things. The show existed to educate movie lovers, moviegoers about what was coming to town, what the movies looked like, because they had these long clips you could watch and say, okay, that movie looks pretty good, and they say they liked it, or at least Gene said he liked it, or Roger said he liked it, and I tend to agree with them, so maybe I'll check it out. So that, I guess, was what the show was originally for. And then maybe perhaps over time that appeal grew and evolved as the show grew and evolved.
Yeah, it's interesting when you bring up the clips, because time runs throughout your book, Opposable Thumbs, because like when they would talk about a film, I was not going, I'm sure you have a similar experience, but I wasn't actively going to the movies until about mid-high school, right? Until I got a driver's license and you got a couple of dollars in your pocket. So whenever they would talk about a movie, this was a much longer gap, right? By the time a thing would come out on VHS or be on late night cable. Like I saw The Shining on late night cable and I never saw a trailer for it. I didn't know what a Kubrick was, right? So, but I'm like, I like horror movies. So I stayed and watched and I'm like, what is this? This is amazing. But there's no like context or anything for that for me. You know what I mean? So you operated a lot more in terms of like discovery that way. So the book is obviously about criticism, but is it also about marketing and film marketing?
Sure. I mean, in some ways it's about the evolution of the film industry over the period that the show was on the air, from the mid 1970s to the late 1990s, and to some extent beyond that. Because yes, the show introduced some of these elements, like, really focusing on clips from movies and showing the potential audience the clips that were, to some extent then, yes, kind of subsumed by marketing. As the show got really big, when the show first started, it was kind of its own little thing in Chicago. It wasn't being noticed by the studios right away. Within a few years, as the show took off and then had a weekly audience in the millions of viewers around the country, the studios started to say, well, wait a minute, what is this show? And how do we try to take advantage of it, or in some ways kind of co-opt the language of it to our own purposes? And so that's how, after the show introduced the thumbs, suddenly thumbs start showing up in advertising, and you start seeing studios making electronic press kits, their own hand-picked clips for their movies, which they would then give out to journalists, not just Siskel and Ebert, but journalists all over the place, all over the country, doing local news or, other nationally syndicated or broadcasted news shows. There's the Gene Shalitts of the world, the Jeffrey Lyonses of the world, countless other local film critics at the time. And yeah, so to some extent, the changes that happened in the industry, the show, certainly had an effect in those ways, and then would would adjust itself in response to that. The clips, as clips of movies became easier and easier to find in other places, they became less and less essential to the show. If you watch an early episode of Siskel and Ebert, or sneak previews as it was called at the time, the episodes were longer in general because they were on PBS. There were no commercials. So they're like 27, 28 minutes. And there would be, sometimes there would be clips that would run a minute, 2 minutes. There are long segments of movies in some of those early episodes. And then when you get to, the 90s, when the show is now syndicated, the show is shorter because it's syndicated. There are commercials. Now it's 22, 23, 24 minutes maybe. And some of that stuff, like some of the stuff that they cut out was a little of the clips. Now a whole review might be 4 or 5 minutes, and there's only 1 minute total of clips, and they're interspersing scenes. It'll be multiple clips, and it's 3 clips in a minute. So that was a change that happened over time. So the show always prided itself on not being beholden to the studios, not being a piece of marketing. It was criticism. They always gave their honest opinions. But yes, it did change over time as the movie industry as a whole and movie marketing specifically kind of evolved over that time period as well.
Movies have always kind of needed that shorthand, like 2 thumbs up, right? You can instantly convey then like what the movie's about, right? Like when you're talking to your friends, like we have stream it or skip it. We have like that movie should belong on Tubi. Like there's always been kind of a shorthand with movies, and 2 thumbs up was one of the best introductions of that, because then it instantly conveys what you're feeling, or whether you agree with it or disagree with it.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of a accidental stroke of genius, I suppose, when they came up with it. Like I said, the show, the show became most well known for 2 thumbs up or, thumbs down, whatever that rating system. But that was not the original rating system of the show when the show started. It did have a rating system even in the earliest days, but it was yes and no. If they liked the movie, they gave it a yes. And if they disliked the movie, they gave it a no. And when Gene and Roger decided they felt they were being underpaid at PBS, they felt like they were not being compensated to their value. And they were probably right. They decided, basically they were made an offer by an ambitious executive at Tribute Entertainment. This guy, Joe Antello, thought, well, maybe I can lure them away and have them do basically their show for us, a new show, and they'll be the hosts, but it'll basically be the same thing, and we'll pay them more money. And that's how he lured them away. And when they started this new show in syndication at Tribune, which was ultimately called At the Movies with Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, they felt, their legal department at Tribune felt, the basic concept of the show of guys talking about movies, reviewing movies, that they could get away with no problem. But they felt that there were certain elements of the original show on PBS that if they tried to carry them over, maybe they would be opening themselves up to a lawsuit. And one of those things was, somewhat hilariously, the yes and no rating system. It was determined they couldn't just take that. They would need a new one. And they had, brainstorming sessions or whatever. And according to the producer of the show, who said she was in the room when this happened, she told me that it was Roger who said, well, what about thumbs up and thumbs down? And that was it. And and that really caught on. And you're right. It was nice to have that kind of shorthand. And sure, there are people who, back then and to this day sort of say, oh, the dumbing down of film criticism, or they've turned criticism into this, objective rating system, or they've simplified it or made it a binary or whatever you want to say.
Lack of nuance.
Exactly, right. And then, to some extent, I guess, if you only think of Siskel and Ebert as that, I suppose that's not wrong. But really, it was, the show was the show, and the show had reviews and conversation and debate and discussion. And then at the end, they would say thumbs up, thumbs down. It was really the fact that those thumbs became so widely used on marketing, on trailers and posters, that I think it started to appear that Siskel and Ebert were just these guys who gave out thumbs to some people.
Like human Rotten Tomatoes or something.
Right, exactly. And so, yeah, I think it really became a great calling card for the show. And yeah, I mean, Siskel and Ebert hasn't been on the air for 25 years now. Roger Ebert, passed away 11 years or whatever it is ago, and the show ended in its final form after that. And I still think, you ask people about movies, and a lot of them will still say, "Oh, it was good." I'd give it 2 thumbs up. Like, that has become sort of shorthand that lives outside of its original creation and purpose.
So for you as a film critic, you're an editor and critic at Screen Crush. When you watch a movie, what is it you're looking for? Obviously, a Marvel movie is different from an indie movie, which is different from a foreign film. All of those are different from documentaries. We call all these things movies. So what are you looking for? What's your perspective or what's your filter when you're sitting down to review a movie?
My personal filter is just like, does it work? Is it entertaining? Is it doing what it's trying to do? What is it trying to do? And does it succeed? If it's a Marvel movie, is it a good Marvel movie? Is it exciting? Is it funny? Is the acting good? Are the effects good? Are the characters rich? If it's a documentary, have I, gained some sort of interesting information about this subject matter? Is it presented in a lively way, or is it just a bunch of people sitting around and talking talking head interviews? Each kind of movie, each specific example of a movie is a different entity. So it's really sort of, to me, it's all about what is it and what is it trying to do? And does it succeed? Which is kind of, it's essentially Roger Ebert had a famous thing that he always said about movies, which is a movie is not what it's about. It's how it's about it. That you could make, any movie about any potential topic could be good. It's not what it is how that particular story is told, how that particular subject is covered. And so I suppose what I just said is kind of my own interpretation or my own perspective on that same idea. It's not necessarily, if a blockbuster is great, wonderful. I love big, fun action movies. I had a great time seeing The Fall Guy recently. I don't think that movie is necessarily aspiring to be Citizen Kane, another movie which has different goals and ambitions. But The Fall Guy, I think, for what it was trying to do, was quite successful on its own terms. So there you go. So that's sort of how I kind of try to approach every movie, with an open mind. I think I think there is this stereotype or this image a lot of people have of critics walking into a movie going, "Oh, now I've got to see this movie or that movie, harumph," that they don't like movies, which is, in my experience, almost never true of anyone, not just me, who does this. Because it's if you hate movies, this is the worst possible job you could have. You have to do this because you love going to the movies, which I do.
Yeah. You acknowledge that as well in the book. Both Siskel and Ebert, you have a couple of quotes from both of them throughout the book about how they love this. They love going to the movies. And this was a passion project for them. And yes, obviously they were being paid to review in the Chicago newspapers, and they were being on TV, but this was fun for them.
Right. I mean, yeah, yes, absolutely. And again, it's if you don't love movies, why would you do this job? Now, granted, Siskel and Ebert in their day, by the time they, became TV stars, they're very successful. They're making a lot of money. And so perhaps that was an incentive to do this job, even if they didn't always love movies, which I think right up until the end, if you watch the very last episodes of the show, you can see that they're still just as passionate as ever, even when Gene Siskel is slowly succumbing to cancer, he's not sitting at home. He's coming to work, partly because he loved his job. He really loved it. And, you can watch him physically. He's in those final episodes. He's really deteriorating before your eyes. But his commitment to the job is incredible. And his passion for when he sees a movie in that final year or so, because he sort of gets sick in the spring of 1998, and then he passes away in early 1999. And you watch those episodes that he made in that year, and it's when he sees something he really loves, like The Truman Show, for example, his enthusiasm is really infectious and exciting. And you go, well, that's why he's still doing this, even though he probably should be resting. He should be taking care of himself or whatever. And he didn't really do that. And I think part of that was because he really loved his job and he loved going to the movies and he loved, when he saw something like The Truman Show, and he could tell people, go see this movie. It is special. It is unique. It is smart. It is interesting. It is funny. Whatever it was, I think Roger, in one of his obituaries for Gene, talked about that, how when he saw a great movie, he would be on cloud nine. He would be excited for days, for weeks. Just one really great movie would, change his mood for days and days. So yeah, that was a job they really loved doing. And now nobody is making, with very few exceptions, the kind of money that they were making doing it. If you're a film critic now, you're probably struggling to make ends meet. So you're not doing this because you think it's an easy way to strike gold. You're doing it because you love movies, you love talking about movies, you think they are important, and you think they're something worth paying attention to and talking about.
I want to tease out that thread because this isn't about nostalgia or even like some sort of like Make America Great Again kind of lens, but it's just that there was a comfort to the authority that we had growing up in the 80s and 90s. Like you would watch a 6 o'clock news with Dan Rather or Walter Cronkite, and in a short time, you find out what's happening in the States, you find out what's happening overseas. We were all kind of on the same page. And Siskel and Ebert did that as well for the movies, right? Because there wasn't a lot of authority back then in terms of like critics and like who had that voice, as we talked about with the thumbs up and thumbs down. So rewatching all the shows for this book, what did you learn about authority and trust? Because people did eventually come to trust Siskel and Ebert.
Yes, they did. Yeah, it's an interesting observation. I mean, certainly they did belong to a period of time where there was kind of much more of a monoculture, and our perspectives on all sorts of things weren't quite so fragmented. We had less options for viewing all kinds of things: movies, television, news, whatever it might be. Music, absolutely. There was just, there were fewer channels and outlets. And so, yeah, there were, people who did kind of have a certain amount of authority. And I do think that Siskel and Ebert were among them, that they did occupy this kind of position in popular culture as like the movie critics. That said, though, there were certainly and surely, I don't have the numbers, but I'm sure there were more people employed as full-time film critics at newspapers, at magazines, then in the heyday of Siskel and Ebert than there are right now. There may be more people writing film criticism or podcasting film criticism, YouTubing film criticism. There were people plying that trade in a hobbyist or a kind of passioned amateur sort of perspective now than there were back then. But there were certainly more people full-time employed doing it in the days of Siskel and Ebert than there are now. So it's sort of, it kind of comes with an asterisk. Yes, Siskel and Ebert were these figures of authority. They were very well known. They were celebrities in their own right. Two Thumbs Up meant something when it was on a poster. People did know them. They did watch the show in the millions in the show's heyday. And even through to the end, the show still had, several million viewers every week in its final years. But there were also great film critics, all through and before Siskel and Ebert. They did not invent film criticism.
Correct, yeah.
They certainly play a huge role in the history of film criticism. They were certainly pioneers in the idea of television film criticism, in the idea of film criticism as a discussion and a debate, like as a format, because that was really not something that really existed in any big way before Siskel and Ebert. The idea of two critics discussing something as its own kind of form of entertainment or its own form of film criticism, that certainly didn't exist. But, Siskel and Ebert had film critics that they liked to read or followed before and during their heyday.
Yeah, and that's also talking about taste as well. You used the word taste 13 times in Opposable Thumbs. Siskel and Ebert famously gave Speed 2 Cruise Control 2 thumbs up. As someone like yourself who makes a living off their taste, how does like film criticism age compared to the actual movie?
Well, I guess it's an interesting thing to think about. I suppose they both age. The movies remain constant,
Mm-hmm.
but our opinions of them can change over time. A movie that, came out with somewhat muted response in theaters can become a cult classic. A movie that won the best picture in a few years, people can go and say, how did that win best picture? That movie is terrible.
Mm-hmm.
And like we can think of examples of that. Now, film reviews, or, if we look at an old episode of Siskel and Ebert, well, that's fixed. You can go on YouTube and you can watch Siskel and Ebert review Speed 2 Cruise Control, and yes, give it 2 thumbs up. And sadly, neither of them are with us today, but it's very possible that if they were, maybe they would have a different opinion today of Speed 2. And occasionally both Siskel and Ebert would cop to the fact that their opinions of movies might change over time, positively or negatively. A movie they love, they might say, oh, maybe I was a little effusive the first time I saw it. Or on the flip side, maybe I was too hard on this movie and now I recognize that it was a classic. I know Gene always said he regretted or at least changed his mind about Slapshot, the classic, Paul Newman comedy. He gave it a middling review. And within a few years, he said, I was kind of wrong about that. I think Slapshot is a great movie. I know Roger Ebert, I don't know if he gave, off the top of my head, I don't know if he gave Unforgiven, the Clint Eastwood movie, a positive or negative review. But either way, it wasn't a rave. He certainly didn't give it 4 stars or anything like that. And even within a few months of seeing that movie, I know he said on Siskel and Ebert, oh, I think I underrated that one, or, I'm paraphrasing, but basically said I missed the boat a little bit. I didn't quite realize how good that movie is. And so, yeah, I guess that's kind of an interesting part about being a movie lover is that, the movies don't change unless I suppose they're made by George Lucas or Ridley Scott or something like that, in
And
which
they
case
change all the
sometimes they
time.
do. Right. And in that case, perhaps they do change a little bit, but we change because we're moving through time and we're growing and we're getting older and our life situations evolve. Maybe our personalities evolve, our knowledge of the world evolves. And so the movie you saw when you were 10 years old does not look the same when you see it at 20 or 30 or 40 or 50.
Mm-hmm.
And that's that's part of the magic of movies, is that different parts of them speak to us in different ways at different times. So that can change and evolve even if the movie does not.
Last question, just circling back to the magic of the movies. As you've done interviews, as you talk to people about Siskel and Ebert, you've done promotion for the book, has this turned into like a secret like clubhouse in a sense? It seems like we all watched Siskel and Ebert, but it didn't seem like we all talked about Siskel and Ebert, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that was something that I kind of discovered, I guess, as I was promoting the book was, like we talked about earlier, when I was watching this show as a 12, 13-year-old, it felt like a secret that only I had, like I wasn't just staying up late hiding this from my parents. I was kind of hiding it from everyone, like there were shows that were popular that I watched when I was 13 years old. And, if it was, when they were on a Tuesday night or whatever it was, or Thursday night, Seinfeld's on Thursday, then on Friday, everyone is talking about the Seinfeld episode or the Simpsons, or I don't know, there were shows like that, the X-Files or whatever it was that, even my dorky friends, we were all into and we would talk about. I didn't talk about Siskel and Ebert with anyone. I had no conception really that there was anyone else watching this show but me. It seemed like this thing that only I was obsessed with, at least in like where I grew up, in my peers, my town, my circle of friends. And again, this is the early 90s. The internet barely exists. To me, it exists as this hard to use thing on my dad's computer. If no one is using the phone for a half an hour, I can log on to AOL
You
and
got
I
mail.
can, Yeah, and I can check my email and I can, go on in a chat room and talk about
Mm-hmm.
Seinfeld or The Simpsons or, something like that. It was a totally different world. Now, perhaps there were Siskel and Ebert, fans out there on those services. I know that Ebert was like an early adopter of the internet. He loved CompuServe, all that sort of stuff, which I never had. So maybe if I had had CompuServe, maybe I would be giving a different answer. But yes, it did seem like this thing that only I was obsessed with, at least until I got a little older. And then I went to college and I met other fans of film criticism and Roger Ebert, and then it started to change. But yeah, one of the loveliest parts about doing the book was once it was done, was talking to people about it and hearing so many people say, when I grew up, this was the show that I loved that I didn't think anyone else loved. And I was growing up, I spoke to people who grew up in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Montana and all over the country who shared similar stories with me. And that was so lovely. It was like we all were a part of this, as I think you called it a secret club, something like that. It was like so secret a club, we didn't even know that there was a club out there. Like we sort of all really connected with the show. And it really instilled this love of movies and criticism and journalism and debate in us at a young age. And we kind of took that with us as we grew up. So yeah, it is sort of this, it is kind of one of the nicest parts about having written the book now, is that it has helped me connect with lots of other people who share that passion that they had as a teenager, as a kid.
Secret handshake.
And it's really nice to see that. Oh, I felt so kind of alone about this when I was a kid, but I really wasn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things we talk a lot about. You'll see online or in podcasts and things like that. People talk about Blockbuster, renting movies, and kind of like there's a whole bunch of old school experiences that we no longer have, and people mourn certain theaters that are gone and things like that. But rarely, never in those discussions does Siskel and Ebert ever come up. Right? It's still kind of like a hidden thing, right? Until somebody like interjects into the conversation. But generally, when we talk about those old timey things, it's not the same thing. And like you don't see a lot of like T-shirts or tote bags or anything like that with Siskel and Ebert in the same way you kind of see Blockbuster logos kind of still circulating around.
Right. Well, that's true. I mean, hopefully part of the reason to write the book was to make sure that
it's on the record.
People do recognize and see that, the importance of the show, not just, in the lives of dorks like me, but to the broader film industry, to filmmakers, all those sorts of things. So hopefully the book will kind of, now that it exists, it can facilitate that. In terms of like merchandise, I mean, I think never really wanted to kind of commodify the show, because that would have maybe, at least in their eyes, it would have kind of diminished their reputations and their sort of, that they were these objective critics, and that's what they were doing. They famously turned down serious money to do commercials when they were in their heyday. They could have made a lot of money hawking Apple computers and maybe other things, and they turned all those opportunities down because they felt like that would be a betrayal for their audience to go from being critics to pitchmen. I would love to have Siskel and Ebert hats or shirts or whatever. I certainly would be wearing them, but that's not up. I'm not the one to make them. I guess you'd have to ask. I don't know if it would be Buena Vista Television or their
Chaz.
widows, but yeah, Chaz or Marlene or whoever it would be. But I don't know. Maybe that's something they should do is make some merch. Again, I wouldn't make a dime off of it. I would be someone wearing it, and I would be quite delighted to do so.
Well, for now, the book is out, which is a good start, and it's Opposable Thumbs: How Siskel and Ebert Changed Movies Forever. So thank you so much, Matt, for like hanging out. Thanks for this like trip down memory lane. Like you said, like the things we touched upon, like the lack of clips and like the lack of access to trailers and things like that. The discussion around movies, like it's just interesting to like see where we started and where we've ended up. So thank you for that.
My pleasure. It was great talking to you.
Wow, that was loud, yo. Yo, that was Matt. His nonfiction book is Opposable Thumbs, How Siskel and Ebert Changed Movies Forever. And I am Sammy, host of My Summer Lair. From the title, this part seems aggressive. How Siskel and Ebert changed movies forever. Yet, as you heard in our conversation, Siskel and Ebert did change the movies. Yeah, the elegant shorthand, of course, 2 thumbs up. The use of clips, decades before YouTube and easier access. One of the fascinating aspects of growing up in the 80s is that I rarely, if ever, saw trailers for beloved movies. Breakfast Club, Terminator, RoboCop, Rocky, what else is Beverly Hills Cop, Back to the Future. I didn't know how these movies came into my life. What prompted me to take a chance on them? Or the reverse. Think about this. Some adult went to the movies and saw coming soon trailers, including one for Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and reacted with an, "Ew, that looks terrible. I don't think that movie's gonna be funny." It's just absurd. But you know what happened? We really grew up in a wonderful yet strange era. That's why I asked Matt if this is a biography about 2 film critics and their popular TV show, or is this also about the evolution of film marketing? And finally, Siskel and Ebert's ongoing legacy includes inspiration. In comic books, so many readers will grow up and become writers and artists and editors. Comic book readers who become comic book creators, it's an established ecosystem. That's what Siskel and Ebert did for film criticism. They helped establish a film ecosystem. So kids who grew up watching movies that they never saw the trailers for would grow up and host podcasts and write blogs and, in short, review movies. They would talk about movies and they would recommend movies. That is exactly what I do with My Pal Sammy, a weekly Substack newsletter. From Set to VCR, hashtag Set to VCR, which are couch-worthy TV recommendations, including many movies, to hashtag pants-worthy movies and events that are worth pants. Not everything is worth pants, people. And just like Siskel and Ebert, I make a living off my taste. You want to get 2 thumbs up from me? I know that's tempting. Sign up today at mysummerlair.com/subscribe or Google My Pal Sammy Substack. If you've already signed up, and hundreds have, I know it's amazing and I'm thankful and grateful. I don't know how this happened. I will give you 2 thumbs up and I'll even throw in a high five. Boom! And yes, unfortunately, yes. If you don't sign up, I'll have to give you 2 thumbs down. And you better believe that sting of that shame, that takes a long time to fade. Sign up today at mysummerlair.com/subscribe or Google My Pal Sammy Substack. Sign up today, please. Thank you so much for listening to me in a Netflix world. Siskel and Ebert, yo.